unchurched talk about church. I was out in the community a couple of weeks ago, and I was introduced to a young woman who, when she found out I was a pastor, began to ask me questions about our church. She told me she was a single mother, and that she was interested in having her children be exposed to the Christian faith, to get them into Sunday school and have some experience of being in the church and in a faith community. At the same time, she was concerned at how she and her children would be received. She explained to me that not all of her children had been born when she was married. And furthermore, she was now divorced. She alluded to the fact that she had experienced a sense of some sort of rejection and judgmental attitudes at other churches that she had tried to go to. And she wanted to be reassured by me that if she brought her children to the New Covenant United Methodist Church, they would not have to experience that sort of attitude on the part of our members. When I hear stories like that, part of me wonders why on earth folks like this woman would be even interested in having anything to do with the church based on how she had been treated in the past. Why would she want to risk subjecting herself and her children to the self-righteous attitudes and condemning voices that she had experienced in churches in the past? The other part of me thinks I understand why she still is asking. My conversation with this single mother reminded me that people long to be part of a community where they will be loved and accepted just as they are. That people long to be in a community where they will not be condemned and shamed for their past or even their present mistakes, but instead will be given the hope of new possibilities, where they will experience love, encouragement, and support in seeking to live a new life and be restored. They want that sort of community so badly that sometimes, at least, they are willing to take some risks to see if they can find it. They still hold out hope that maybe someday they will find that sort of faith community. And when they take the risk of looking to people like me to be reassured that they will be welcomed as they are, here's what I think they're really asking. Is there a church somewhere that will live up to what it says it believes? So how about it, brothers and sisters? If you were in my case, in a situation, if someone was asking you about New Covenant United Methodist Church and told that same story, what would you tell them?
Tell them to come.
Would you tell them, yeah, this is a safe place for you and your children? I don't think anybody will look twice at you because you don't fit into our idea or somebody's idea of what should be done in a person's life. Would you say, yes, come, bring them? Well, I have to tell you that that's pretty much what I said. I'm pretty confident that this would happen. That has been my experience here, for the most part at least. But this is a journey for all of us. And we're going to find out a little bit more about the fact that no matter how accepting and how loving we are, we can always do better. And we can continue to strive to be the kind of community where all people can come in and be accepted and loved as they are. And then letting God continue to deal with them in whatever areas they need to be dealt with, just like God does with us. I want to invite us to continue to strive to be that community. If that is our desire, we have a lot to learn from the early church, because they were certainly a safe place for all kinds of folks. Actually, they were not very safe for religious people, but, but anyone else, the church was a safe place. The community that Easter created was a community of restoration, just like what we've been talking about. We're talking, as I said before, over the next several weeks in the book of Acts, in order to get a clear idea of the community that Easter created. The book of Acts, remember, is the book of the New Testament that tells the story of the early beginnings of the community that we call now the church. Last week we learned that the community that Easter created was a community of courageous resistance. Today we want to continue our exploration of Acts by looking at a passage that shows that, just as I've been saying, that the post-Easter community was truly a community of restoration. The community that Easter created was a community of restoration. I'm not saying that they never struggled to live up to that goal, or that they never experienced it as a challenge, but the trajectory in the early church was towards becoming a community that embraced even the most unlovable and gave them the hope that they needed to dare to live a new life in Jesus Christ. The early church was a community that understood that Jesus Christ was still alive, and that the power of his love and grace could radically transform the lives of even the most broken, bitter, angry, and sinful people, and that no one was too far gone to be rescued or restored by the power of Christ's mercy, grace, and unconditional love. I got to get an amen from that. Amen. No one, they understood, was too far gone, that they could not be rescued and restored by the power of God through Christ. And today we have a powerful example of that. Perhaps the most powerful example of this community of restoration at work is found in Acts chapter 9, which we read just a moment ago. This passage tells the story of the conversion of a man named Saul. We read how this man, Saul, was on his way to the city of Damascus when suddenly a light appeared to him that was so bright and so intense that it literally knocked him off his feet. And then in the aftermath of him laying there on the ground, he looks up around and he discovers that not only has this light knocked him off of his feet, but also it has blinded him and he cannot see anything. And then out of this light, a voice comes and says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul responds to this voice by asking, who are you, Lord? And the voice answers, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And from that moment, Saul's life is turned 180 degrees around. Powerful story, isn't it? Well, there's two things that we need to know about this fellow Saul. First, at the time that we meet him in Acts 9, he is probably the most, or certainly one of the most powerful and dangerous enemies of the followers of Jesus. He is a zealous Jew who hates Jesus and everything Jesus stands for. He sees Jesus and his followers as people who have betrayed the Jewish religion, and as such, he thinks that they need to be put down and that he has a role in making that happen. He has no official standing amongst the Jewish leadership, but he is so zealous, so learned, so intelligent, that the leaders see that he could be of use to them. And so they authorize him to be responsible for this campaign against the followers of Jesus. We read a few chapters before this in Acts 7 of how Paul was basically presiding over the stoning death of the first martyr in the Church of Christ, Stephen. And Saul was involved in that. And then we read in this passage how he has been given specific responsibility and authority to go to Damascus and literally drag Christians out of the synagogues in Damascus and take them to Jerusalem, where who knows what sort of fate would await them. Saul, the first that we need to know is about Saul, is that he, at the point we meet him, is a powerful and feared enemy of Jesus and his followers. But the second thing we need to know about Saul is that this experience of meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus changed him forever. In fact, after that day, his life was so transformed, his world was so rocked, his story was so revolutionized that the name Saul didn't seem to fit him anymore. Saul was the name of another person in another life. And to reflect that reality, Saul started calling himself Paul. That's right, if you didn't know it, Saul was the earlier name of Paul, the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote a good portion of the New Testament, the guy who next to Jesus is probably the most significant shaper of the Christian faith. Saul becomes Paul. Saul, who was a persecutor of the church, miraculously and overnight gets transformed into a champion of the church. Now, there's more to this story. The other part of the story is just as important, because while Saul is making this transition from Saul to Paul, the community of Jesus' followers, who only knew him as Saul, need to find a way to put aside their fears, their distrust, their anger, and to some degree their hatred of Saul, and embrace this fellow whose very name caused a shiver to go down their spine of fear. Acts 9 not only tells of Saul's conversion, but it also tells us how a man named Ananias, a follower of Jesus, leads the way in welcoming Saul into the fold. Now think about this for a moment. Put yourself in Ananias' shoes, or any of those early followers of Jesus. Even you can say, oh, well, he saw a vision. But, you know, visions are strange sorts of things, I think. I think most of the time, if I were to have a vision, I'd be saying, did I really see that? Because it's not part of our usual thing. So in spite of this vision, Ananias had the human task of letting go of his fear and distrust and suspicion of this man named Saul. He needed to find that way and to embrace this fellow. And as I said, Acts 9 not only tells of Saul's conversion, but perhaps the conversion of the early church. It must have been, as I say, hard for Ananias to let go of his fears. But don't forget that Ananias is a follower of Jesus. He's a part of an Easter community that had experienced the resurrection of Jesus Christ. As I said on Easter Sunday, if Easter is real, if Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, then anything can happen. And in the light of the resurrection, it becomes possible, very possible, for even someone like Saul to change overnight. And in that same light, it becomes possible for an entire community to believe, to trust that Saul has in fact been changed. And that is critical. Because without that community, without that acceptance, my guess is that Saul would never have made it to Paul. I love how the story unfolds in our scripture lesson. Ananias, after his vision, goes to see Paul, who at this point is still unable to see. And what are Ananias' first words to Saul? Don't miss this. What did he say? He said the first thing was, "Brother Saul." Well, those are some beautiful words under this circumstance. They're beautiful anyway, but especially under these circumstances. Can you imagine the profound impact those words of welcome must have had on Saul? Can you imagine the hope that it awakened within him, racked as he was with guilt over the fact that in his zeal, he had turned out that he had been fighting the very God that he was trying to help in his persecution of the Christians. That even he, who would later describe himself as the chief of sinners, could be forgiven and restored. I think in a way that the scripture hints at this when it says that when Ananias greets Saul with those words and praise from Saul, his sight is restored. But along with his physical sight being given back, suddenly Saul can see the possibility of a whole new life in Christ. I can't help but wonder how much of this Saul would have been able to imagine or see if he had not been met with those precious words, "Brother Saul." See, that's what it means to be a community of restoration, to look even the most despicable person, the most notorious person, the most degraded person in the eye and tell them, "You are my brother, you are my sister, you and I are kin." And in so doing, to open up for them the possibility of being transformed and to let them know that we have their back. You see, we have this language that we use all the time. We say, "Oh yeah, God has your back." Well, it's much easier for a person to believe that God has their back if they know the people in their church have their back. So do you have each other's backs, brothers and sisters? And if somebody walks in here who's in a world of trouble, do you have their back? Will Willimon, some of us may be aware of him. He's a retired bishop of the United Methodist Church. Before he became a bishop, he was the dean of the chapel at Duke University. And he tells of a situation that he experienced. He says, I met this student in his sophomore year when he arrived at Duke as a transfer student. He was in the chapels most Sundays. One day in the fall, I took him home with me for a sandwich. And as we sat there eating, he said, I want to tell you something about me so that you can know me a little bit better. Okay, he said. Well, so then the fellow continued on. He says, well, first I was a teenager from hell. I made my folks' lives miserable. And Willimon says, well, that's not too original a story around here. I hear that a fair amount. But he continued, this young man. He said, they had me committed to a mental institution when I was 16. But I escaped from there, made my way to Chicago, worked as a prostitute on the streets, got into lots of stuff. One night I rolled this guy, took his wallet, and used his American Express card to buy some stuff. Wow, Willimon said. I thought you meant that maybe you got a speeding ticket somewhere along the way. I told you I was bad, said the young man. Anyway, cops got me. I was sent to Joliet prison. That was like entering the depths of hell. But this older prisoner took me under his wing to protect me. And every night before lockdown, he would read a chapter out of the Bible to me, out of the Gospel of Luke. He wasn't too good a reader, so it took a long time as he stumbled over the words and stuff. Well, one night he was reading from Luke about the stories about the lost sheep and the prodigal son and all, and it was like this hand just reached into that cell, grabbed me by the throat, shook me up and down and said, I've got plans for you. Well, I got saved. I got out of that prison in a few months and finished my high school degree, and I'm here on full scholarship. Wow, says Williman. We don't hear stories like that around here too often. Well, the young man continued. The reason I'm telling you this is that you're a preacher, right? And I know you guys are always grubbing around for stories, illustrations and stuff. And you got Easter coming up in a few months. Well, I am proof of Easter. Amen. It's not just these dramatic Damascus Road stories that witness to the reality of the resurrection. A whole community of people can serve as proof of Easter. The more we act like we really believe that God is in the people-changing business, and that God is well able to raise anyone, even people like us, even like people like you and me, even the desperate person living down the road from us, even the person sitting in a prison cell, stewing in their own bitterness, plotting their revenge. I tell you, brothers and sisters, there are dramas just waiting to happen. There are resurrections and restorations that God is getting ready to do. The part that is scary is that we don't get to control when or how or to whom it happens. In fact, the more we try to control it, the more we will put ourselves out of contention for being involved. We can't control all of this. And so when the last person you would expect shows up at the door of the church, or maybe even your front door, if you can't say, "Welcome, brother. Welcome, sister," even the best case scenario is that they will just go somewhere else to be welcome. I don't even want to imagine the worst case scenario. In a few moments, we're going to share the Lord's Supper. And I'm reminded of yet another story. This was in a church that did communion old school, Methodist style. You know these altar rails that we have? In a lot of Methodist churches, even still today, people just come down and they kneel or they stand at the altar. And then the pastor and the helpers just go down the road and they share the communion with each one sitting. Well, one time there was a fellow, he was a judge, a big, important man. Everybody respected him, and he was kneeling at the altar rail. And a young man was kneeling next to him, and he said, to himself, the judge said, that boy, that young man sure looks familiar. I know him from somewhere, but I can't place it. And afterwards, he took this fellow aside. He says, "I think I know you." He said, "Well, I sure know you. You are the judge who sentenced me to prison. And while I was there, I met Jesus." If we are a community of restoration, we understand that the ground right here is utterly even. No matter who is here. Judge, ex-con, ordinary folks who struggle just to get through days like you and me. The ground here is level. And the church that is a church of restoration lives that out and says, "Welcome, brother. Welcome, sister. I'm just one beggar who found bread, and now I'm telling you where that bread comes from. It comes from Jesus, who can, because he's resurrected himself, bring you back to life." Amen. Amen.